to worry all the time about every little thing, driving myself crazy, wondering how I seem. Well, I've had enough of worrying, drinking someone else's drink.
I am here with Mr. Andy Stern, who served as the president of the Service Employees International Union from 1996 to 2010, overseeing massive growth in its membership. He also served on President Barack Obama's Simpson-Bowles Committee, which was convened to address both medium and long-term solutions to America's fiscal situation. He's also the author of Raising the Floor, How a UBI Can Renew Our Economy and the American Dream. And I'm very happy that he gave us this opportunity to interview him.
And I'm so glad to be here, I must admit.
So, what is the primary reason you support a universal basic income?
So my primary reason for supporting a universal basic income is what's been happening to American workers today, and then what more significantly I think is going to happen in the future. So we now know that less than 25% think the economy is good or very good. We know that the majority of people don't believe in the American dream, and they're factually correct in that 47% of Americans couldn't find $400 if they had an emergency. So that's today. As I like to say, it's somewhat like Uber today, which is, what are we going to do with the workers who are independent contractors? But then there's 10 to 20 years from now, which I'm really focused on, which is Uber tomorrow, when there are no drivers,
Right.
when there are no truck drivers, when white-collar professions and legal professions and medical professions, all are overcome by increasing technology. And so I wrote the book because I think we need to have a discussion about what's happening, and that we need to talk about potential solutions, and UBI is the best one I found.
Absolutely. And you mentioned in the book Moore's Law, and that one of the largest employers in the United States, trucking companies, might become completely obsolete because of driverless cars. Do you believe that the future of work will be completely automated, or do you believe that many of the tasks that workers undertake each day will simply be replaced?
So, I think this is a continuum, that technology, because of Moore's Law, which allows for the doubling of the power of computers every 18 months to 2 years, means that this is not about incremental growth, it's about exponential growth, which is why, for instance, even driverless cars, which people several years ago said would not be on the roads till the mid-2020s, are now on the roads in San Francisco and Pittsburgh already, because we just don't appreciate the impact of the effect of doubling of computer speed. So I think there will be jobs that will be completely eliminated. Translation, for instance, being one. There will be jobs like in the medical profession that would just be a lot more efficient. We already see, in the past, if you would imagine doing hip, or knee replacements, it was in the hospital, you were there for a long period of time, but technology has advanced to the point these are outpatient procedures that are done regularly in America. So we will have some jobs eliminated, trucking being a significant one, in fact the largest one in 29 states, some being made more efficient, and then I would say there will be a small group of jobs that will increase to be able to, the skills to service the new economy.
Right. So do you believe there will be a stigma attached to these workers that are structurally unemployed because of this change? What could we maybe do to resolve that stigma?
But I think there is a stigma attached, and I think this election was about it, the quote, deplorables.
Mm-hmm.
The people who did what America asked of them. They went to work, they got a good job, they tried to take care of their family, they sent their kids to college. It is not about people doing the right or wrong things, this is about a massive shift in the economy, that is producing winners and losers, and that we need to not blame individuals for a set of circumstances well beyond their control. I don't think there's any question that if you even look at today, the kids that tend to be in the garages in Silicon Valley are the sons and daughters of wealthy people, because no one else can afford to live for a year or two being an entrepreneur or an inventor. My members had no friends and family to raise, so they couldn't take those risks. They couldn't walk away from a job. A woman who's in an abusive relationship can't just walk away if she has no income. A convict coming out of a prison, is in pretty desperate shape because he has no ability to get a job. So, I think that giving people assets and giving them stability, has always proven to give people willingness to take more risk. I think the one job we could use a lot more of is philosophers right now, because I don't think we have a vision of what happens in a world where we can produce so much of the goods that we need and the food that we eat without the same proportion of workers that we once did.
I find that idea really interesting. People like Senator Marco Rubio during the GOP debates actually say we need less philosophers and we need more welders. But it looks like the structural flow of the economy is actually privileging people that think in higher terms. And
I think, this is also the time horizon question is really important. Right now there's a shortage of welders, and at the same time, Fortune read an article about how robot welders the price of welding will be reduced to $2 an hour. So, while there's a shortage today, it is one technological innovation on its way already, to ending a shortage and creating a surplus, of welders. So I think that's kind of the problem sometimes with the debate is we don't talk about now. So as I said, you can talk about Uber drivers now and what we could do to get them Social Security, or how we could get them workers' compensation even if they're not employees. But when there's no one driving the car, the debate is fundamentally different. And I think the problem with most elected officials is they're kind of talking about today. And Donald Trump is kind of a leading example of not appreciating that 88% of the factory jobs we lost were due to technology and 12% were done to trade. So, changing our trade laws is important, but technology is going to run along no matter. No one has historically stood in its way of advancing. Slowed it down, but never stopped it.
Makes sense. You also cite Piketty in the book when you note that inheritance of wealth may continue increasing trends of income inequality. You also note that some well-to-do families already provide a UBI of sorts to the Silicon Valley types. Do you believe that there's a moral case for a universal basic income, apart from its economic justification?
Well, I think there's two cases to be made, particularly to three cases for wealthy people. One is, and it's not just really wealthy people, more and more of my friends who are parents, supplement their children's income by taking them on vacation or paying for a bill they didn't expect, which provides enormous stability compared to someone who can't find $400 when they have, Two is I do think there is a moral responsibility. When there's a surplus of wealth and it's just maldistributed, I don't think it's about everybody getting something equal. But I also don't think it's about 6 people or 8 people, which Oxfam just reported, having as much wealth as the bottom half of the globe.
Right.
And I think the third thing, which is for risk management purposes, which we're now hearing at Davos a lot, it's going to not take too long for wealthy people to understand they better do something to sort of provide some moral and economic relief to people.
To balance populism.
Exactly. It's just a balance and uprising, that is going to probably occur over time. Whether people are lucky it's being done in the ballot box.
What level of scale do you believe will maximize UBI's potential? Does the government have a critical role to play in this?
Yeah, I think that many of the experiments that are being done, whether it's give directly in mostly Africa or others that are going to take place in other countries, are sort of establishing answers to legitimate policy questions. When people are given money, do they work more or less? Do they buy liquor? Do they buy alcohol? Do they start businesses? What do people do? Or in the case of Finland, the people who are given money who are unemployed take more willing to take a job that pays less because their income is being supplemented, which in the long run saves the government more money than paying them completely to either work or not work. So I think we're testing a lot of policy issues. In Alaska, in the United States, is a huge test because it's a semi-isolated place, giving every citizen a dividend off the oil reserves. But I don't think until government gets involved, you're going to really have, the resources and the scale. And I think, there is a philosophical question that since giving people cash is the cheapest program to administer, and if you believe in the end that, in freedom and liberty and choice, the average person, I think I'm willing to believe philosophically and bet practically that giving them money and letting them make their own choices produces a better outcome than having them deal with a whole set of bureaucracies and administration that are pretty demeaning at times and haven't proven to really end poverty or solve the problems they were intended to do. The synergy has been there on the welfare issue from Martin Luther King to Milton Friedman.
Do you believe that it would have any tangible benefits for people that are already employed, especially in terms of their labor power?
Well, I think, for people who a universal basic income just provides a level of security and stability when you're trying to make choices. So my partner gets a job in another city. We need two incomes to live. Are we stuck and locked in or does a UBI help, facilitate that? I'm a handy person, or I have a certain skill. I don't really want to work for somebody, and I have a universal basic income. Can I take the risk to walk away and start my business and see how I do without risking my house, my family, and my life because I have a certain basic level of support? People have much more power in the labor market. If you have an employer who keeps changing your work schedule and it's messing up your child care arrangements or your other responsibilities at your church or your little league, you just tell people, I don't want the job. If I can't get some kind of stability in my schedule without feeling like I'm going to be destroyed economically, and certainly for workers who have a collective bargaining agreement, it's like a strike fund. So,
Sure.
There's lots of labor power. This switches over to individuals from employers.
But I suppose in some ways this could also be beneficial to employers, having employees that have more resources available to them. How would you answer people that say that the EITC kind of a bad version of a UBI, you might say, is a subsidy to businesses, that perhaps businesses should just raise wages or be forced to do so instead of the government providing this money on the back end?
So, I think that's a totally legitimate argument that we're currently subsidized employers. And if people didn't get food stamps and EITC and housing vouchers, they'd either be a lot poorer or they'd make a lot more demands. To me, the real issue is making companies be part of the funding mechanism that helps do that. So as they're receiving funding on one hand, that at least a portion of that funding is by virtue of their paying taxes, or VAT taxes, or corporate taxes, or some kind of taxes that helps not make this about them making more money and the government substituting, but them contributing the part of or all of, the supplements that people are getting.
So to invert the question a little bit, there's a lot of business coalitions that bemoan the minimum wage because these businesses, of course, have to make really intricate decisions about how many people they keep on staff. They might choose to automate faster in some cases when the minimum wage is increased. Do you believe that businesses might support something like the universal basic income if it meant that government wouldn't meddle as much in the labor market?
Yeah, I think there's a place which I wasn't willing to go, but many people who I know who are younger supporters of UBI, would ask why we need a minimum wage. If there's universal basic income, the labor market will function better when people have the ability to walk away. It's a little too extreme for my union-minded lifestyle, that's true, but, again, it's a potentially interesting experiment that someone, could do. But, I think there's a number of issues for employers. One is having customers, because if less and less people are working, We always say there's not enough demand in the economy over time, so someone has to buy products, and UBI is a way to help support people that buying, purchasing. The minimum wage has, no impact on certain kinds of employers with high margin, and has huge impact on people with lower margin. So it's a really imprecise way. I mean, UBI is just a better way more egalitarian way to prop up the labor market without distorting, some of these issues.
Absolutely. Do you believe that smaller countries might be uniquely primed to try out UBI? And in Asia in general, do you believe that countries have reached a rate of development where this would be feasible?
So I think there's a series of issues for the countries in Asia. One is the ILO report on footwear, clothing, and textiles for Vietnam, Indonesia, and Cambodia, which talks about Indonesia losing 60%, 4% of its workforce in those areas. Vietnam 86 and Cambodia 88%. That's a pretty devastating numbers for the major industry in those three countries because of technology. The ILO has a report out that says 60-something% of the jobs in India are at risk. In China are at risk for automation because they've had the kind of Foxconn electronic workers who are now being replaced by robots. So it's much easier, it's just a question of are people willing to make the investment in technology that already exists versus having cheaper labor, and Foxconn being probably the largest manufacturer of electronic components is making that switch. So we're now seeing huge, problems at the low wage and low skill end of the market in Asia that's going to be effective. India, interestingly, has had a number of its states say they're going to implement a basic income in the next year or two, particularly Kashmir. And so India is looking for it as an better anti-poverty thing than subsidizing food and subsidizing housing and subsidizing fuel. They're thinking maybe we should just give people cash. And I think for, more developed countries like Taiwan, who probably are not immune any more than anybody else from the technological advancement on jobs, through AI, and, that they're going to have to deal more like Finland, where they're not, because they got rid of lots of the low-wage jobs to China as the manufacturing center, are not at risk as much on the very low-skilled jobs. But like every country, including the United States, truck drivers, buses, all these things are. So I think they're going to need to rethink, what their plan is for the future.
I just wanted to thank you on behalf of the conference, Mr. Stern, for meeting with me for this interview. It's been very informative.
Well, thank you, and to all the people in the conference. It's an enormously important discussion, and I so appreciate your taking the time.
Hi, everybody. This is James Davis with the Universal Basic Income in the Asia Pacific Conference. Today, I'll be interviewing Albert Wenger, who is a partner at Union Square Ventures. He has started several successful firms in the past, and he received his bachelor's degree in economics and computer science at Harvard and an information technology Ph.D. from MIT. And so we're very thankful to have him here today. Would you care to introduce yourself further, Albert?
No, I think that was a good summary. I've been a partner here at Union Square Ventures for over a decade, and we invest actively in internet startups and technology startups in North America and in Europe. Some of our better known portfolio companies include companies like Twitter and Etsy and Twilio.
Absolutely. And are there any new projects you're looking forward to in the near future we'll want to keep our eyes open for?
We've been investing a lot in the blockchain area over the last couple of years, and I expect that we will do more of that. We've started looking at AR and VR, and we've started looking at genetics companies. There's a lot of activity in both of those spaces that we think is going to be interesting for years to come.
Wonderful, wonderful. So going to the subject of the conference, a universal basic income, I just wanted to know what first introduced you to the idea and got you interested in this type of policy.
Sure. As you mentioned in the introduction, I have studied both computer science and economics, both as an undergraduate and as a graduate student. And so I've been thinking about the intersection of how does digital technology influence society for a long time. And I've obviously been looking at it both from an academic perspective, but then also as a practitioner and entrepreneur and investor. So starting 2012, I became fascinated by what people call the decoupling chart, which is the chart that shows GDP growth and it shows sort of labor share, which kind of goes along with GDP, and then sometime in the last 20 to 30 years, suddenly the labor component sort of goes sideways as GDP still continues to grow. And to me, that was the most clear macro indicator that technological change is having a large-scale impact. And that's when I started thinking about, okay, what are some of the right reactions to that, and what are some of the right ways of thinking about this change?
Absolutely. Well, you mentioned in your book there's a lot of things we need to unlearn about the world. Are there any things that people need to unlearn about redistribution policies in order to make a universal basic income a feasible policy?
Yeah, so my book is called World After Capital, and it's called that because I believe that the defining element of the industrial era was the scarcity of capital, physical capital. And I think that the defining scarcity of the digital era will be attention. We have come to think of money as a fixed budget, that the government has a household budget, and so we've been thinking about, okay, well, we can spend it on traditional social safety net, or we can spend it on basic income, and people trying to make the math work. And I do think that's very much a red herring, because what we really need to look at is we need to look at the productive capacity of the economy. And there's no doubt that we have enough capital in the world to make clothing for everybody, to make food for everybody, to make housing for everybody, etc. So in fact, that's a small part of our global productive capacity today. So the question then is, well, if we know, just looking at the math of what the output of the economy is relative to what people's needs are, if we know this, then the question becomes one of, okay, what is the way to make money circulate quickly enough so that people can afford those things? And so I've become much more convinced that the right answer here is not to think about the traditional sort of taxation system, although we should be making changes to taxation as well, but rather to think about the monetary system and to think hard about, do we really need fractional reserve banking the way we've been running it for some time, or could we get money into the economy just by giving it to people? So instead of QE, quantitative easing for banks, I'm becoming much more convinced that the right strategy is to do quantitative easing for the people, essentially.
And I suppose quantitative easing specifically, a lot of those funds end up in the hands of households that already have wealth.
Exactly, absolutely. People who already have capital, like myself, now have access to even more capital. And so the current approach to quantitative easing through the banking system has amplified the concentration of capital as opposed to worked against it. Absolutely, I think that's a spot-on observation.
Why are we just now seeing universal basic income come to the forefront of academic thought again? And what steps can we take to mainstream it as a big idea?
For this idea to really become a mainstream idea, there are many related ideas that we need to start changing in people's minds. So people have a very hard time thinking about things that have happened outside of their own life experience or the life experience of their immediate ancestors. And so we have this conception that the only way to organize the world is that people have jobs, and that jobs are the source of income, because that's what our parents have done and maybe our parents' parents. But if you zoom out a little further in human history, that's not been the primary arrangement of human affairs. For 1,000,000+ years we were hunter-gatherers. Then for 8,000 years or so we lived in agrarian societies. In most of those societies you weren't selling your labor and have a job and receive a salary. You were either making things or you were growing things. in order for this idea to become more popular, we also need to popularize the idea that, hey, the purpose of a human being isn't to go, drive a truck or clean a toilet or flip burgers. There's some other more foundational purpose of humans. When we had agrarian society, we had sort of cultural and religious systems that gave meaning to life in agrarian society. It was the great chain of being theory. You sort of were born into a station in life, and we had a lot of cultural thoughts on what that meant. Then, when we had industry, we invented such things as the Protestant work ethic, which were sort of new creations. They didn't always exist. And so I think to popularize this idea, we need to popularize the idea that human purpose can come from very important sources other than your job. So they can come from taking care of other people, whether that's family, friends, strangers, taking care of other species. So in order for us to popularize the idea of basic income, we have to popularize a much broader narrative that culture and society and economy can be very different from, and have been very different from, the ones we've seen over the last 100 years. And so one of the projects I love a great deal, for instance, is a project in Berlin called Mein Grundeinkommen. And Micha and Johannes happen to be in New York at the moment, so I'm going to see them tomorrow. What they've done is basically created a crowdfunding platform, and then they sort of lottery off. They randomly draw a recipient, and it's not a full basic income, it's actually just 1 year. But it's done a wonderful thing for popularizing the idea, and among other things, what it's done is it shows that different people wind up doing very different things once they get this opportunity. It shows that one of the foundational aspects of basic income is this idea of enhanced personal freedom. In my book, I call it economic freedom. It gives you true freedom to allocate your time to whatever you'd like to. That is a foundational freedom that we need, and what a project like this does is it popularizes this notion that really we should be free to allocate our time.
Absolutely. So if people did have more time and we transitioned from an industrial society to a knowledge society, do you believe that this floor, this basic income, might enable the growth of industries we just don't even see right now? Do you believe that that knowledge could breed new jobs even in a post-capital society?
Yeah, I do believe that, but I think it's very important to understand what kind of jobs. And I think the key element is that it will be activities in which we would like to interact with a human qua there being a human. So last night I went to a concert in Madison Square Garden with our youngest son. Now, we've had perfectly good recording technology for a long time, and yet we still go to concerts where we like to see humans perform. Why is that? Because there is a very deep emotional bond that happens, and it happens because we understand that this person is performing for us at this moment, and that this person is another human who has experiences similar to our own experience, who has a mental interior life similar to our own interior life. This is related to a foundational notion in philosophy called qualia, which is this idea that when we experience the world, it's not just that we see a red chair, it's that we have an experience of what it means to see a red chair. And one of our sort of shared elements of humanity is that we suspect that another human, like you sitting across from me, has a similar experience of looking at this red chair. So we will have many areas where a machine could provide a more precise, better, higher quality solution, and yet we will prefer a human, qua there being a human. A silly example of this is serving food in a restaurant, right? Like, we could probably, in the not too distant future, build a robot that can do that. But most of the time, we actually would prefer to have a human who is giving us their attention, because when somebody's bringing you their food, it's not just the act of bringing their food, it's also their commentary maybe about the food. It's the fact that they have made the effort as a human to try and present it to you in a way that makes it appealing. All of those we value because they are human, not just because of the performance of the task. And so I believe one of the things that basic income does is it will free people up to explore lots of activities in which we value humans qua there being humans. Another good example of that is maybe taking care of elderly or sick, right? We might be able to build robots that can do that perfectly well, but I think that in many of these instances, people will prefer to deal with a human. Now, I should also quickly point out there will be many instances where people will prefer to deal with a robot. Like online, we have lots of evidence that people are, when they first want to discuss something they feel really sort of nervous about, like maybe a mental health issue or something, they actually sometimes prefer talking to a machine because they think the machine won't be judgmental and won't have the, oh, what a silly person kind of reaction. So I actually think that this question of how the economy evolves it's very, very difficult to predict, and part of the beauty of basic income is that we don't have to predict what those jobs are. So instead of government saying, here, go into this government training program for this job, which government has always been bad at, what it does is it frees people up to create this new society, to create this new economy.
Absolutely. So, in your book, you also push back against this teleological idea that history will have an end and that we'll inevitably make these breakthroughs. Can you kind of explain what you think the future will look like in 100 years as it relates to universal basic income? Why do you push back against theories like those of Marx and Fukuyama that say history has a set end?
So, because I believe in the importance of human choice, there isn't just, I'm not just pushing back against sort of a kind of historical determinism a la Marx, but also against a technological determinism. There's a lot of people in technology who say, oh, technology by itself, we're going to build more technology, and by itself, it's Kevin Kelly's what does technology want? It's this idea that somehow technology wants decentralization, wants to push power to the edge. And I don't see it that way at all. What technology does is it increases the space of what's possible. And that increased space contains many different points, some points where there's more power to the individual, but some points where there's more centralized power. And it is up to us humans to develop a system of values and then make choices based on that system of values as to what kind of society we want to live in. For me, the central animating foundation and objective foundation for these values is the existence of knowledge. This question about what does society look like in the future is knowledge is central to human affairs. It defines who we are as humans. It is also the thing that we need to generate more of in order to survive. We're facing climate change at a global scale. And so if we do not generate enough knowledge, we will not know how to cope with this climate change. And it will provide a massive setback, potentially wiping out human civilization.
So what would you say to critics who say the money provided for a universal basic income could be better spent on mitigation strategies for climate change or redirected toward industries that could solve these problems directly?
I think it's a fundamental misconception of the role of money, because it suggests that there's a finite pool of money that can only be spent once. But money, of course, circulates. In fact, money is a type of commons. We all use it, and it never really sits idle. The times it sits idle is when people create large individual pools of wealth that they then don't reallocate. But most of the time, when like you give some basic income to somebody, that person turns around and buys a piece of clothing or a piece of food, and then that piece of money immediately travels on. The veil of money is a very strong veil, and it cloaks a lot of people's thinking. Because what we really are talking about in the world is you never eat money, you never clothe yourself with money, you never drive in money. Like, you don't drive in a set of gold bars. You drive in a car or a train. And the money is just this short intermediary stage that's required to make markets work, and that's required to solve certain timing problems. I'm in the business of investing in companies. Why is it that companies need to raise money at all? Well, it's only because normally there's some period where you spend money before you have a finished product that people can buy. But if you think of such things as Kickstarter, for instance, and other platforms like Indiegogo, where you can pre-purchase products, well, all of a sudden, those companies need to raise far less money or no money at all. Money is just this, it's just this facilitator. It's this facilitator of real economic activity. But because we've gotten so deep into the financialization of the economy, if you look at the financial sector, it has blossomed to be massive relative to the real economy. We're really confused and deeply foundationally confused about the role of money. Money is just a means to an end. And so where that money starts its journey in the economic cycle is completely irrelevant.
That makes sense. So now that we've kind of explored the philosophical grounds of a universal basic income, what practical criticism of basic income policies do you take most seriously? And what steps do you think that policymakers could take to at least alleviate concerns about those criticisms?
So I'll provide a strange answer, which is, I think the only valid criticism of basic income is that basic income by itself is not a panacea. So I actually believe that we will need to change more things. In my book, I talk about 3 freedoms. I talk about economic freedom, informational freedom, and psychological freedom. Basic income is one component, it's the economic freedom component. But we also need to talk about informational freedom. Who has access to information? Who has access to computation? Who controls computation? Will it be controlled by a few large corporations, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, or will it be controlled very broadly in a very decentralized fashion? And then there's the psychological freedom component, which I think is also incredibly important and people don't talk enough about, which is our brains did not evolve in this information supersaturated environment. That is, if we don't get a better self-regulation of our own brains and how we interact with the environment, you could easily see a scenario where you get basic income and then all you do is all day long is refresh your Twitter feed or look at another cat picture on the internet. And that would not be a very good outcome. So I think that my criticism isn't one that's internal to basic income, it is external, saying that is one very important component, but it sure will not be enough by itself. There's more that we need to change to get away from industrial society.
So the way you see it, we need a cultural change as well.
Yes, a very important cultural change, because so much of our culture is caught up in jobs. You know, people who don't have jobs are losers, they're on welfare. You know, we value people according to their jobs. So, but we've very much defined everything around jobs. We've defined education entirely around jobs. So, you know, why is it that people are so nervous about which, like, elementary school their kids get into? Well, because they're nervous about which high school, because they're nervous about which college, because they're worried about which job their kids are going to get. So we have completely instrumentalized education around jobs. So yes, I think we need a large cultural shift, and those are hard and they take time and they can't be dictated from above. I mean, you know, we saw that the sort of where that can lead with the Cultural Revolution in China. So that's why my book is about enhancing individual freedoms, so that through enhanced individual freedoms, people can figure out for themselves, not through government or me or somebody else telling them how to live in this future world that we're headed towards.
Fascinating. In terms of the experiments we're seeing developed around the world, we see Finland starting their trial of a basic income policy. You mentioned your friend's project in Germany, Y Combinator in Oakland, California. What
Give Directly in Kenya.
Give Directly, absolutely. What experiments do you think hold the most potential? And
I'm supportive of experiments, and I like, you know, what Give Directly is doing because it comes closest to actually testing universal basic income by going after entire villages at a time as opposed to individuals. Nonetheless, at the highest level, I don't believe we can test our way towards the future. You know, I work with entrepreneurs every day, and entrepreneurs develop an idea and then they go for it. Now, yes, they do small tests along the way, they adjust, they do A/B tests, they develop early prototypes, but not with the sense of we're gonna go run a test over here so that then later we can build the real product over there. So I want to compare it to democracy. Like, once people decided that democracy was an important thing, they weren't It's like, let's run a small democracy experiment in some small country so we can figure out whether we want to have democracy in our own country. I mean, that's not how it worked. People were like, no, democracy is the right way to organize society, so we should have it here and now. And that's how I feel about basic income. It's the right strategy for dealing with the amazing technological capabilities that we now have. And so we should start to implement it, and we should work our way towards it everywhere around the world. And we shouldn't go, we need a lot of tests.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, this has been Albert Wenger and myself for the Basic Income and the Asia Pacific Conference. Thank you so much for taking the time with us today.
My pleasure.
This is James Davis, and I am here with Mr. Huston, a regional director from Give Directly, a charity that, with a lot of success, has been able to transfer money directly to its aid recipients, with nearly 93 cents on the dollar going directly to the people that need it.
Yeah, so I'm excited to be here and great to talk about the emerging debate on basic income.
So I first wanted to start with a question about how you all structure your transfer system. Why does Give Directly make the basic income universal in each village rather than just targeting the poorest people in each village?
Yeah, and so this is something we debate a lot internally. And so Give Directly has been operating for the last 5 or so years, and typically what we'll do is exactly the latter thing you mentioned. So typically we'll sort of seek out the poorest people in each village and give them with a lump sum transfer. As we've seen the debate on basic income emerge, we wanted to make sure that we were providing a true test of the policy being debated. And so in the study we're doing evaluating basic income, we've chosen to enroll all adults universally within each village, and then compare them to adults in other villages who aren't receiving, and use that to sort of give us the sense of the impact. And the reason why we did that is there's a risk of, if you sort of only seek out the poorest people, that you're not truly testing the policy. That there's a couple of facets about basic income. First, that it's possible that if everyone receives, the incentives or the effects on society are different. That maybe you're worried that people will stop working, but that doesn't really happen unless everyone's receiving. Or on the flip side, maybe you're interested in different sort of emergence of social projects or community sort of change the amount of time people are spending on community activities, but maybe you don't see that until the payments are provided universally. I think the other sort of aspect is making sure you're getting a sort of full set of society receiving. That an important question is not just how do the poorest of society spend the cash, but also, is it worth it to give cash to people who are modestly better off? And I think a sort of important aspect of that question is seeing how do those people spend it, and what are the outcomes those people see when they receive cash.
So it comes down to positive externalities for the entire community, and also the need for a control group, you'd say.
Yeah, I think there's those pieces, and then also, aside from the positive externalities, how do the sort of richer people who might normally be left out of a social program, how are they affected by basic income?
Makes sense. So how does Give Directly address critics that say that a basic income could make people lazy, or that they could misspend the money on things like drugs and alcohol? Is there a way that your program has been able to test whether or not that's true?
Yeah, and so this has been, a question or a criticism of cash that's, lasted for decades. And the evidence on cash is exactly the opposite, that we've seen now literally hundreds of evaluations of cash transfer programs all over the world. And the pattern is remarkably clear, that if you give poor people money, they spend it on things that improve their lives. And the things that you don't see are, first, basically out of any of the studies that track time spent on things like work, you never see a decrease. If anything, in some studies they've found increases of work. And the second thing that's very clear is you don't see increases in spending on things like tobacco or alcohol or gambling. And so the sort of starting evidence on cash transfers in general is remarkably clear. Whether or not we find something for basic income, which is a specific form of cash transfer, we'll see. But I think our sort of prior or starting assumption should be pretty strongly rooted in the evidence, which would suggest that these things don't happen.
Makes sense. Some critics have also pointed out that, at least in the communities that you all serve, there's actually not a lot of great capital goods to invest in. So a lot of recipients might spend it on livestock or like People in the West might look down on those capital investments just knowing that they're not able to have access to nicer technologies. Do you think that there's a role for other charities to continue subsidizing access to those goods that aren't produced locally?
Yeah, I think I would first sort of respond to the premise. Something we saw in a randomized control evaluation of our sort of lump sum program is that even after the money stopped, sometimes up to a year after the money stopped, if you tracked recipients of the cash transfers, their income before and after the money, their incomes were 30% higher, even long after the cash has stopped. And that's consistent with people having, a sort of array of pretty strong investment returns. You'd be very lucky to get a 30% investment return in something like the stock market. And I think that's something that's often sort of confusing to donors or to sort of people looking from the West is the investments don't always look like what we expect. They don't look like a startup or, a sort of specific technology. It may be in things like livestock or buying more land for crops or maybe investing in a plow to sort of get higher crop yield. But those things, the evidence bears out that those things actually are pretty high return. And you also do see people spend things that might seem higher tech. We've seen recipients buy solar panels, for example, and set up businesses where they charge other people's cell phones. And so I think you see those things as well. That's just sort of my thought on the general premise. I think on the question of are there sort of is there room for other charities to fit? And I think absolutely that in certain cases there might be specific supply problems, maybe in delivering medical goods or medicine or specific technologies that very well could sort of be better served by the government or other charities. I think it should be clear that cash is not a panacea. It's not going to sort of solve all of the problems that a poor person might have. But one advantage of the cash is that it lets them prioritize their problems, that you give them money and they spend on whatever is most important to them. And so I think it's a sort of good starting bet for how you might want to help someone.
Absolutely, absolutely. So in your experience, Give Directly has surely faced a number of cultural challenges working with these communities. That's not unique to Give Directly by any means. We see examples in which mosquito nets that have been donated are actually just used as wedding veils, and sometimes technology that's just given away freely is used for alternative purposes because communities didn't have much need for it. How do you all address cultural challenges, and do you think that your model of just giving cash helps you get around them at all?
Yeah, I think it helps us get around some and introduces us to others. Something we find in Kenya that I think you would find if you were handing out cash in the US is that it's a very strange proposition to show up at someone's door and offer them $1,000 or to show up and say we're going to give you a basic income for 12 years. That's a pretty strange thing to say, and people are understandably skeptical often that they might wonder whether or not there's going to be some type of catch or if there's going to be strings attached to the money that you have to spend it in a certain way, you have to pay it back. And so, or that maybe the money is related to the government or a specific person or something like that. And so we spend a lot of time basically introducing ourselves, explaining our program, explaining why we do it, that the evidence shows that people spend it really well, and then explaining that we're independent from governments or specific people, and then as a result that the money is totally up to them. They can spend it on whatever they want. If they spend it, quote, poorly, the only cost is that they didn't get to sort of use a great chance to improve their lives. But yeah, the sort of lesson we found is that as you enter a community or introduce yourself, you have to sort of reinforce key themes repeatedly.
Sure. Kind of changing direction here. Obviously, you all have a certain level of scale as a charity. Do you believe that any challenges that Give Directly has faced can be applied to larger models? If governments are looking to implement this policy, what advice would Give Directly have for them?
I should start with saying that governments have a host of other challenges. They sort of experience different practical problems if they have a greater scale, and also a number of different political problems. And so a big part of our goal is to test questions that can then inform policy. And we've done that in the past with different studies we've done on cash transfers, and that's how we view our role with this basic income study, is basically acting as a kind of design lab for cash transfers and testing out this particular model of basic income and seeing how it works, so governments can then sort of see and choose how they might want to scale it up. I think operationally, some of the things we've done well that some government programs use already, and some programs could probably use more, is having all of the kind of enrollment of a recipient in a cash transfer program, ensuring that all of that is digital. And so from basically the very first interaction our staff have with a cash transfer recipient, we'll record all the information digitally on mobile phones. That'll then go into a database and spit out the next interaction that we're supposed to have with that recipient. Then we'll sort of run logic on the set of interactions we've had with them and see if they're eligible or not. Then we'll sort of pay them through mobile money, and then we have a full-time call center that's similarly looking at digital information to decide who to follow up with, and then recording that information digitally. Having all of those interactions stored digitally lets you maintain pretty tight pipes between the source of the money and the desired recipient, that you can track all of the sort of different types of interactions. You can ensure that the money is sent directly to the recipient's phone. You can see if someone has changed the data along the way to divert it somewhere else. And so I think that's been a pretty exciting development in social protection technology broadly, is the sort of digital data collection paired with mobile payments. And that's something I would love to see scaled up even more to more government programs.
Well, given your personal experience in China, do you think there's any aspect that makes a UBI feasible or attractive?
I think a general thing that's very clear over the last few decades in China is that the country as a whole has experienced incredible growth. Literally, the growth that China's experienced over the last few decades has taken hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But there are pockets of people who are still extraordinarily poor, that there's still sort of residual inequality and residual pockets of very, very, very poor people. And so I think the potential promise of a basic income in China is that it could be used to raise the floor. This is a phrase Andy Stern uses a lot, but that when you have that type of situation of the creation of a lot of abundance, but sort of still persistent poverty in the country, using cash transfers to target that is a pretty attractive option. And I think we'll see whether or not universal basic income or more targeted cash transfers would be the best approach. But I think that sort of set of facts in China presents a pretty promising reality for using cash transfers to help poverty.
So you mentioned that you all explain the benefits of a universal basic income, or in Give Directly's case, the cash transfer to the recipients in order to bridge a cultural barrier, that it's kind of odd to just reach out to people and give them money. Do you believe that people in their self-reported data might give a rosier picture of reality because they're grateful for the cash transfer? And how does Give Directly kind of test for that self-reported bias that might occur?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think a problem with sort of impact evaluation in the development sector or even in government policy sector broadly is it includes a lot of cases where the aid giver is acting the aid recipient if they're happy with the product. A thing we do to get around it is to use external data collection. And so in all of our randomized controlled trials, we'll work with a different organization to do all of the research surveying. And so in the case of the basic income pilot, there's an organization called Innovations for Poverty Action that before we ever set foot in a community, will go to both the communities that will receive cash and the communities that won't, and ask them a set of standard questions. And then they'll go back 6 months, 12 months, 24 months after the cash has already begun and track the progress. And so I think that sort of external data collection and making it clear to people that there's a difference in the sort of roles of the different organizations helps a lot. There's also techniques you can use in how you ask the question to sort of try to suss out the sort of true picture versus the rosy picture.
Thank you very much, Mr. Huston.
No, thank you so much for having me.